What happens when a man of peace, determined to disprove another's faith, takes a hammer to a symbol he doesn't believe in, only to face something he can't explain? This is the story of Kenji Sato, a Buddhist traveller whose pride led him to destroy a cross in the heart of Jerusalem and whose own beliefs were tested by what followed. What began as an act of intellectual rebellion ended in something no philosophy book had prepared him for, an encounter that would strip away everything he thought he understood about faith, humility, and the invisible forces that connect us all. In the ancient stone courtyards of the holiest city on earth, where 3 world religions intersect and millions have sought divine answers, one man would learn that some questions are better left unasked, and some symbols carry weight far beyond their physical form. Kenji Sato had spent 13 years travelling the world with a single purpose: to understand the architecture of human belief. At 38, he had documented spiritual practices across 42 countries, from the meditation caves of Tibet to the ayahuasca ceremonies of Peru, from the whirling dervishes of Turkey to the fire-walking rituals of Fiji. His apartment in Kyoto was a museum of comparative religion, Buddhist prayer wheels beside Sufi poetry, Hindu mantras transcribed in elegant calligraphy next to Taoist philosophical texts. He had studied under monks in Thailand, discussed non-dualism with Advaita teachers in India, and spent 3 months in silent retreat exploring the depths of his own consciousness. But Christianity he dismissed with the same intellectual contempt some reserve for pyramid schemes or flat earth theories. Western mythology for people afraid of death, he would tell anyone who asked. A carpenter becomes God because his followers needed a father figure. It's psychologically transparent. Kenji's own Buddhist practice emphasized empirical observation and personal experience. The Buddha himself had said, "Do not believe anything simply because you have heard it." This principle had become Kenji's shield against what he considered the superstitious dogma of Abrahamic faiths. Jerusalem was supposed to be the final stop on his research trip. 3 weeks documenting how political conflict twisted religious devotion into tribalism. He had planned to interview pilgrims, photograph sacred sites, and write a blog post titled, "When Geography Becomes Theology, The Delusion of Holy Places." The irony of what would actually happen there was lost on him completely. On his 3rd day in Jerusalem, Kenji joined a university-sponsored tour of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where Christians believe Jesus was crucified and resurrected. The tour guide, Professor Sarah Cohen from Hebrew University, was a religious studies scholar who treated all faiths with academic respect, rather than devotional fervour. This church, she explained to the diverse group of tourists and students, has been a pilgrimage site for nearly 17 centuries. For believers, this ground holds the most significant moment in human history, the death and resurrection of their saviour. Kenji took notes on his phone, already mentally drafting paragraphs about the commodification of spiritual experience and the tourist economy built on Bronze Age myths. But as they moved through the church's dark, incense-heavy interior, something unexpected happened. The intellectual detachment Kenji had cultivated began to crack. He watched an elderly Armenian woman, probably in her 80s, crawl on her knees toward the Stone of Unction, the rock where tradition says Jesus' body was prepared for burial. Tears streamed down her weathered face as she kissed the stone, her lips moving in whispered prayers in a language Kenji didn't recognize. A young Brazilian couple stood before a small wooden cross, the husband's arm around his wife's shoulders as she sobbed quietly. They held a photograph. Kenji glimpsed enough to see it was a child, probably their son, maybe 3 or 4 years old in the picture. An Ethiopian monk sat in a shadowed alcove, his dark face illuminated by candlelight, reading from an ancient Bible, with a concentration so complete he seemed unaware of the dozens of tourists flowing past him. These weren't the mindless sheep Kenji had expected. They were people carrying visible pain, seeking comfort in rituals he couldn't understand, but whose emotional impact was undeniable. Professor Cohen paused before a section where a wooden cross stood against ancient stone. This particular cross, she explained, isn't the original, of course. The current structure dates to the 16th century, but for pilgrims the historical authenticity matters less than the symbolic resonance. This represents the moment when, according to Christian theology, human suffering was transformed into divine redemption. Kenji raised his hand. But doesn't that just reinforce a victim mentality? teaching people to glorify suffering instead of preventing it. The professor smiled with the patience of someone who had heard every objection. That's one interpretation. Another might be that it teaches people suffering is not meaningless, that even in our worst moments we're not abandoned. Different frameworks, different conclusions. Or, Kenji pressed, it's a psychological coping mechanism that prevents people from demanding actual solutions to injustice. Perhaps, Professor Cohen replied. But after 40 years studying these questions, I've learned that dismissing 2 billion people's most profound experiences as mere delusion might itself be a kind of intellectual arrogance. The gentle rebuke stung more than Kenji wanted to admit. That evening, Kenji found himself in the common room of Abraham Hostel, nursing Turkish coffee and processing the day's observations. The room was crowded with international travellers, backpackers from Europe, volunteers from America, pilgrims from South America, students from Africa and Asia. A conversation at the next table caught his attention. 3 young Christians, 2 Americans, and a Filipino were discussing their experiences visiting the holy sites. Their voices filled with emotion, Kenji found both fascinating and irritating. "I can't explain it," said Marcus, one of the Americans, a 20-something, with a cross tattoo visible on his forearm. "But standing where Jesus died, I felt him, like actually felt a presence. I know how that sounds, but..." "You felt emotional overwhelm triggered by cultural conditioning and architectural manipulation," Kenji interrupted, unable to stop himself. "The church is designed to create that response. Dim lighting, incense, acoustic properties that amplify whispers. It's all psychological theatre." The 3 Christians turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from surprise to defensiveness. "That's pretty reductive," said Maria, the Filipino woman, her English carrying a gentle accent. "Have you considered that maybe some experiences transcend materialist explanations?" "I've considered it, and found it lacking evidence," Kenji replied, feeling the familiar comfort of intellectual combat. "I'm Buddhist. We don't need supernatural interventions to explain human consciousness or suffering. The Buddha taught us to rely on direct observation, not faith in invisible beings." "But you do have faith," Marcus pointed out. "Faith in the Buddha's teachings, in karma, in rebirth." "Those are philosophical frameworks, not supernatural claims," Kenji cut him off. "I don't claim the Buddha was God, or that he rose from the dead. Buddhism is psychology, Christianity is mythology." The tension in the room thickened. Several other travellers had stopped their own conversations to watch the debate unfold. James, the other American, leaned forward. He was older, probably mid-30s, with the calm demeanour of someone who had argued theology many times before. "Kenji, that's your name, right? I'm curious about something. If you're so certain Christianity is false, what would it take to prove it? What would convince you that maybe, just maybe, there's something real behind the symbol?" "Nothing," Kenji said flatly. "Because there's nothing to prove. Your God is a cultural construct, your cross is wood, and your resurrection is a story told by people who couldn't distinguish grief hallucinations from reality." "So you've made up your mind without investigation," James observed quietly. "Isn't that the opposite of the Buddha's teaching about not believing things simply because you've heard them?" The comparison stung. Kenji felt his face flush with irritation. "I've investigated plenty," he snapped. "I've read your Bible, studied your history, examined your claims. It's all internally inconsistent and historically questionable." "Have you prayed?" Maria asked softly. "What? Have you actually prayed to Jesus? Asked him to reveal himself if he's real? Or have you just intellectually dismissed the possibility without experiential testing?" Kenji laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "I'm not going to pray to something I know doesn't exist. That's like asking me to conduct a scientific experiment on unicorns." "Unless," James said carefully, "the reason you won't pray is because you're actually afraid of what might happen if you did." The accusation of fear made something dark twist in Kenji's chest. He stood abruptly, his coffee cup clattering against the table. "Your God is a fairy tale," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent common room. "If he were real, he would stop me from disrespecting your precious symbols, but he won't, because he can't, because he doesn't exist." Maria looked genuinely sad. "Please don't do something you'll regret just to prove a point." "I never regret pursuing truth," Kenji replied coldly. That night, lying on his hostel bunk, Kenji couldn't sleep. Maria's question kept circling through his mind. Have you actually prayed? The answer was no. In 13 years of studying religions, he had never once genuinely prayed to any deity he didn't already believe in. He had always observed, analysed, documented, but never participated with real openness. Was that intellectual honesty or intellectual cowardice? By 3 a.m, Kenji had convinced himself that the only way to maintain his integrity was to prove, definitively and publicly, that Christian symbols held no power beyond human superstition. The idea formed with the clarity of certainty. He would return to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre before dawn, before the crowds arrived, and strike the wooden cross, not vandalism for its own sake, but a philosophical demonstration. If the Christian God existed, he would protect his symbol. If he didn't, which Kenji was certain was the case, nothing would happen, and the emptiness of religious devotion would be exposed. He spent Tuesday preparing, his movements methodical and calm. He purchased a metal rod from a hardware shop, telling the shopkeeper in broken Hebrew that he needed it for tent repairs. He scouted the church grounds, noting that security was minimal in the pre-dawn hours when only a few monks were present for morning prayers. He told himself this was necessary, that sometimes truth required uncomfortable demonstrations, that he was doing the world a service by exposing the emptiness at the heart of Christianity's central symbol. What he couldn't acknowledge, was the seething anger beneath his intellectual justifications. Anger at his own mother's deathbed conversion to Christianity after a lifetime of Buddhist practice, her final words in Japanese mixed with whispered prayers to a carpenter god Kenji couldn't believe she actually trusted. Anger at the missionaries who had convinced her that her own traditions were insufficient. Anger at a universe that allowed suffering without the tidy explanations his Buddhist studies had promised would bring peace. The anger had been growing for years, and now it had found a target. Wednesday morning arrived, grey and cold. Jerusalem's ancient stones seemed to absorb the pre-dawn darkness, making the city feel older than time itself. At 4:47 a.m, Kenji left the hostel carrying his backpack with the metal rod hidden inside, wrapped in a towel. The streets were nearly empty. A few early morning shopkeepers, some elderly residents walking to prayer, a stray cat picking through garbage. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre loomed ahead, its door guarded by a single drowsy attendant who barely glanced at Kenji as he entered. Inside, the vast space was dark, except for hundreds of votive candles creating pools of trembling light. The air was thick with centuries of incense, prayer, and human longing. Kenji could hear chanting from somewhere deep in the church, Ethiopian monks performing their ancient morning liturgy. His hands shook as he approached the wooden cross. Now that the moment had arrived, his certainty wavered. The cross looked different in the candlelight, not triumphant or threatening, but almost vulnerable. Simple wood carved by human hands, darkened by age and touch, worn smooth by millions of prayers. It's just wood, Kenji told himself, just a symbol of superstition. This proves nothing except that matter is matter and prayers are wishes cast into void. He pulled the metal rod from his backpack. The sound of it sliding free seemed impossibly loud in the sacred silence. For a moment he stood frozen, the rod raised, looking at the cross. And in that moment, a thought he hadn't anticipated whispered through his mind. What if you're wrong? He pushed the thought away violently. Doubt was weakness. Truth required courage. The metal rod came down with a sound that echoed through the ancient stone space like thunder. The wood cracked. A piece of the horizontal beam splintered and fell to the floor with a clatter that seemed to wake the very stones of the church. And then something happened that Kenji would never be able to explain. A gust of wind rose from nowhere, impossible in this enclosed space, scattering the candles, sending prayer books tumbling from their stands, blowing Kenji's hat from his head and his camera from his shoulder. The wind didn't feel like air, it felt like presence, like attention, like something vast suddenly noticing him. In that silent moment before dawn fully broke, Kenji heard something that made his blood freeze. Not a voice, not exactly, but a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The echo of his blow seemed to hum through the air, resonating with a frequency that matched his own heartbeat, a pulse that wasn't his, but somehow was connected to him more intimately than his own breath. The sensation lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, Kenji Sato felt, for the first time in his life, genuinely afraid of the invisible. For a moment, after the strike, nothing happened. The cross stood damaged but upright. the crack running diagonally across its horizontal beam like a wound. The supernatural wind, if that's what it had been, died as suddenly as it had risen. Kenji laughed, a sound that came out more like a gasp. "See?" he said aloud to the empty church, his voice shaking slightly. "No lightning, no divine intervention, just wood breaking like wood breaks." He bent to retrieve his camera, his hands trembling more than he wanted to admit. The fear he had felt moments before already seemed like imagination, adrenaline, the product of guilt and Gothic architecture. "I did it," he thought. "I proved it. Their God is as powerless as I always knew he was." But as Kenji walked back through the narrow alleys of Jerusalem's old city, something felt wrong. The ancient stone buildings seemed to tilt at angles they shouldn't, their shadows falling in directions that didn't match the rising sun. The morning call to prayer from a nearby mosque sounded distorted, stretched like an audio file playing at the wrong speed. Kenji stopped walking, pressing his hand against a wall to steady himself. His vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in from his peripheral sight. The ground beneath his feet seemed to be moving in slow waves, like water instead of stone. "Excuse me, are you all right?" A voice in English, accented, maybe Italian or Spanish. Kenji tried to respond, but found his mouth wouldn't form words. The last thing he saw before consciousness left him was the concerned face of an elderly man, a shopkeeper, arranging his produce for the day. Reaching out to catch him as he fell, he woke in Hadassah Hospital, fluorescent lights harsh against his eyes, the antiseptic smell of medical facilities sharp in his nose. A nurse, young, probably Palestinian, based on her accent, was checking his vital signs with practiced efficiency. "What happened?" Kenji's voice came out hoarse. "You collapsed in the old city," she explained, making notes on her tablet. "A shopkeeper called an ambulance. The doctors have been running tests. Your vitals are all normal, surprisingly. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen levels, everything checks out fine. Then why did I—" "The doctor will be in shortly to discuss it." She smiled professionally. "But the preliminary diagnosis is a severe stress episode, possibly anxiety-related. Have you been under unusual pressure lately?" Kenji wanted to laugh. Unusual pressure? He had just vandalized one of the holiest sites in Christianity, but he said nothing. Dr. Naomi Levi arrived 20 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the weary competence of someone who had worked emergency medicine in Jerusalem for decades. She had seen everything from terrorist attacks to religious ecstasy to tourists overcome by Jerusalem syndrome, the psychological condition where people become convinced they're biblical figures. "Mr. Sato," she said, settling into a chair beside his bed, "your tests are remarkably normal. Heart, brain, blood work. Everything suggests you're a healthy 38-year-old man, which makes your collapse interesting from a diagnostic perspective." "Stress," the nurse said. "That's our working theory. Have you experienced any traumatic events recently? Anything that might trigger an acute anxiety response?" Kenji almost told her. The confession was on the tip of his tongue. "I destroyed a cross and something impossible happened." But he swallowed the words. "Just travel fatigue," he lied. "I've been on the road for months." Dr. Levi studied him with the particular attention of someone who knew she wasn't getting the whole story. "I'd like to keep you for observation overnight. Sometimes stress manifests in delayed ways. We'll run a few more tests, make sure there's nothing we're missing." That night in the hospital, Kenji couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes he saw the same image, the cross cracking under his blow, the impossible wind, and most disturbing, a hand reaching out from the broken wood. Not real. Obviously not real. Just his guilt manifesting as visual hallucination, but the hand in his mind's eye wouldn't go away. It wasn't angry or vengeful. It was simply open, palm up, fingers slightly curled, as if inviting or offering something he couldn't name. Around 2 a.m, the night nurse, different from the day shift, an older woman with grey hair and a crucifix hanging from her necklace, came to check his vitals. "You're not sleeping," she observed, her voice carrying gentle concern. "Can't quiet my mind," Kenji admitted. "I've worked in this hospital for 32 years, she said, adjusting his IV even though it didn't need adjusting. "I've seen many things that medicine can't fully explain. Bodies that should have died but didn't. Recoveries that made no scientific sense. And I've seen people make themselves sick with guilt over things they've done." Kenji felt his heart rate increase. Did she know? "Whatever you're carrying," she continued softly, "it's heavy enough to make you collapse in the street. Sometimes the body knows what the mind won't admit." "I don't believe in guilt as a medical condition," Kenji said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. The nurse smiled, not unkindly, but with the wisdom of someone who had heard every form of denial. "The interesting thing about guilt is that it doesn't much care whether you believe in it or not. It just is." They released him Thursday morning with instructions to rest, reduce stress, and consider seeing a therapist if the symptoms persisted. Kenji returned to his hostel feeling physically fine, but mentally fractured. For the next 3 nights he couldn't sleep, not the ordinary insomnia of travel or jet lag, but something more profound, a state of heightened awareness that made actual rest impossible. He kept hearing sounds, faint at first, barely distinguishable from the ordinary noises of the hostel, plumbing, other guests, traffic from the street, but gradually the sounds became more distinct, wood creaking, wind whispering, and beneath it all, a rhythm that matched his heartbeat but somehow wasn't his heartbeat. On Friday night, he tried to meditate, his usual practice, the technique that had brought him peace for 15 years. He sat in half-lotus position on his hostel bunk, focusing on his breath, attempting to observe his thoughts without attachment. But instead of the usual settling into stillness, his meditation became a nightmare. Every time he closed his eyes and turned his attention inward, he saw the hand, always the hand, reaching out from darkness, palm open, not grasping but offering. And now there were words, not spoken aloud, but present somehow in the space between thoughts. "Why are you running? What are you afraid to see? You asked for truth. Why do you flee when truth answers?" Kenji's eyes snapped open, his breath coming in rapid gasps. This wasn't meditation. This was psychological breakdown. He was experiencing some kind of trauma response clearly. The guilt of vandalism combined with cultural conditioning from his mother's deathbed conversion was manifesting as auditory and visual hallucinations. He tried different meditation techniques, Zen counting, loving-kindness practice, body scanning. Nothing worked. The moment he closed his eyes, the hand appeared, and with it, that sense of vast attention focused solely on him. By Saturday night, desperation drove him to what he had sworn he would never do. Alone in his room at 3 a.m., Kenji whispered into the darkness, "If you're real, if any of this is real, then show me clearly. Not visions, not feelings, something unmistakable." The response was immediate and terrible. The presence he had been sensing suddenly felt infinitely closer, as if his prayer had opened a door he couldn't close. And in that moment of connection, Kenji experienced something that shattered his Buddhist detachment completely. He felt loved, not approved of, not rewarded, not even forgiven yet, just loved, unconditionally, impossibly, by something that knew every thought he had ever had and loved him anyway. The experience lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but in those 10 seconds, every intellectual certainty Kenji had built over 13 years of study crumbled like the cross under his metal rod. He spent the rest of the night crying, deep, gasping sobs that seemed to release years of accumulated pride and isolation, and the particular loneliness that comes from believing you understand everything. Sunday morning, Kenji woke with a clarity he hadn't felt since arriving in Jerusalem. He knew, with the kind of certainty that transcends logic, what he needed to do. He returned to Hadassah Hospital and asked to speak with the night nurse who had checked on him. The staff was confused. Patient visitors weren't common, but after some negotiation, they agreed to give her his message. Miriam, that was her name, Miriam Cohen, met him in the hospital cafeteria during her break. She looked exhausted from a night shift, but listened with complete attention, as Kenji, for the first time, told the truth. He confessed what he had done, the challenge in the hostel, the planned vandalism, the strike against the cross. He told her about the impossible wind, the visions, as the sleepless nights. He told her about the hand reaching out, about the presence that felt both terrifying and infinitely gentle. Miriam listened without interruption, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her expression unreadable. When Kenji finished, his voice was hoarse from talking. "I'm losing my mind," he said. "Or I encountered something real. I can't tell which is worse." Miriam was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Then she said something that would redirect the entire trajectory of his life. "Maybe that hand you keep seeing, maybe it isn't punishing you, maybe it's inviting you." Inviting me to what? To stop running from what you already know is true, to stop proving things and start experiencing them. Kenji felt tears threatening again. But I destroyed... A symbol, Miriam interrupted gently. You destroyed wood and proved that wood can be broken, but you didn't destroy what the wood represented. You can't destroy that with hammers or arguments or skepticism, and I think that terrifies you more than anything, the possibility that love might be real and indestructible. She reached across the table and took his hand, the simple human touch of comfort. The Jewish tradition teaches that teshuvah, repentance, isn't about feeling guilty. It's about turning around, choosing a different direction. You can't undo what you did, but you can choose what you do next. I don't know what to do next, Kenji admitted, his voice breaking. Then maybe start by going back to where you broke something and see if you can help fix it. Monday morning dawned clear and cold over Jerusalem. Kenji woke early, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. He walked through the waking city, past shopkeepers rolling up their metal shutters, past tourists already photographing every ancient stone, past pilgrims making their way to morning prayers. The church of the Holy Sepulchre stood exactly as it had always stood, massive, weathered, carrying the weight of 2 millennia of faith and doubt and human longing. Kenji's hands shook as he approached the entrance. He expected to find police, security, accusations. What he found instead was silence. The damaged cross had already been repaired, not replaced. Repaired. He could see where new wood had been carefully joined to the old, the craftsmanship invisible except to someone looking for it. Fresh flowers surrounded the base, along with dozens of votive candles flickering in red glass holders. An elderly friar was sweeping the courtyard, his brown cassock worn but clean, his movements slow but purposeful. He looked to be in his 70s, with a lined face that spoke of decades spent in service and prayer. He noticed Kenji standing frozen and smiled, not with judgment, but with simple acknowledgement of another human presence. Kenji approached hesitantly. "Father, The words caught in his throat. The friar continued sweeping, his broom creating rhythmic whispers against ancient stone. "The cross is repaired," he said, in accented English. "We're used to repairing things here. Violence is not uncommon in a city where 3 faiths claim the same ground. I'm the one who—" Kenji's voice broke. "I'm the one who damaged it." The friar paused his sweeping and looked at Kenji with eyes that held no surprise. "Yes, I know." "You know?" "The security footage is quite clear. We've been wondering if you would return." He went back to sweeping. "Most don't. They break things and run, afraid to face what they've done." Kenji felt his legs weaken. "Aren't you going to call the police? Have me arrested?" "Do you think that's what you need?" the friar asked, not looking up from his work. "I don't know what I need. I don't know anything anymore." The friar stopped sweeping and studied Kenji with the particular attention of someone who had counselled thousands of troubled souls. "Why did you do it? What were you trying to prove?" "That it was just wood. That your faith is delusion. That God doesn't exist and doesn't care, and certainly doesn't protect his symbols." "And did you prove it?" Kenji laughed, a sound caught between bitterness and wonder. "I proved that wood breaks when you hit it. But I also—" He struggled to find words. "I experienced something I can't explain, something that's been following me for days. I can't sleep, I can't meditate. Every time I close my eyes, I see a hand reaching out of the cross I broke." "Not from the cross," the friar corrected gently. "From what the cross represents." "I don't understand." "The hand you see," the friar said, leaning on his broom, "belongs to someone who was nailed to a cross 2,000 years ago. Someone who died there, believing that suffering could be transformed into love. That's what the cross means. Not victory through power, but victory through surrender. You tried to destroy the symbol, and instead you encountered what the symbol points to." Kenji sank onto a stone bench, his carefully constructed Buddhist detachment finally collapsing completely. "What do I do now? How do I fix this?" The friar considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then, without a word, he held out his broom. Kenji stared at it, confused. "I don't understand." "You asked how to fix what you broke. Start with this. Sweep the courtyard. Help me gather the broken pieces. Faith isn't about grand gestures or theological certitude. It's about what you do with your hands when your mind doesn't have answers." Kenji took the broom. That Monday, he swept the courtyard for 5 hours, collecting dust and debris, arranging the pieces of broken wood, that craftsmen hadn't been able to use in the repair. His back ached, his hands blistered, but something inside him began to settle. Not peace exactly, but something closer to acceptance. The friar, he learned his name was Brother Sebastian, originally from Germany, but living in Jerusalem for 43 years, worked alongside him in companionable silence. Occasionally they would talk, but mostly they just worked, the rhythm of service creating its own form of meditation. "I'm Buddhist," Kenji said on the second day, as if this fact might change Brother Sebastian's willingness to let him serve. "Yes, I gathered," the friar replied, trimming dead flowers from one of the memorial arrangements. "Buddhism teaches compassion and mindfulness, doesn't it? Good principles for sweeping courtyards. But I don't believe in your God. I don't believe Jesus was divine. I don't know what I think anymore." Brother Sebastian smiled. "Faith isn't about what you think. It's about what you do when thinking fails you." On the third day, tourists began to notice Kenji. Some assumed he was part of the church staff. Others recognized him from his distinctive appearance, a Japanese man in Western clothes, sweeping with the intensity of someone performing a sacred ritual. One elderly woman from the Philippines approached him after morning prayers. "Thank you for caring for this place," she said, her English heavily accented. "My son died 3 years ago. When I pray here I feel him close. People like you who keep it clean. You make it easier for us to find peace." Kenji felt tears burning his eyes. I don't deserve your thanks." "None of us deserve anything," she replied simply. "That's why grace is grace." By the fourth day, Kenji had developed a routine. He would arrive at dawn, before the tourist crowds, and help Brother Sebastian with morning preparations, lighting candles, arranging flowers, sweeping the courtyard. Throughout the day, he would continue cleaning, helping pilgrims find their way, occasionally talking with other volunteers about the church's history and meaning. At night, he would return to his hostel exhausted but no longer haunted. The visions hadn't stopped completely, but they had changed. The hand reaching out no longer felt like accusation or judgment. It felt like what Miriam had suggested, invitation. On the fifth day, a group of Christian students from South Korea recognized him from his damaged cross. They had seen news coverage of the incident, though Kenji hadn't realized it had made news. "You're the one who attacked the cross," said Min Jun, a theology student about Kenji's age. His tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. Kenji stopped sweeping, preparing for condemnation. "Yes." "And now you clean it?" I don't know what I'm trying to do. Fix what I broke, maybe." Min Jun nodded thoughtfully. "In Korea, we have a practice called kintsugi. Wait, that's Japanese. You know it?" Kenji laughed despite himself. "Yes, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the cracks part of the design." "Exactly. Maybe you're doing kintsugi with your soul, making your brokenness part of who you become." The conversation stayed with Kenji throughout the day. Was that what was happening? Was he being repaired in ways that made the breaking somehow necessary? On the sixth day, something shifted. Kenji was sweeping near the repaired cross, moving slowly, when he heard singing, a group of Ethiopian Christians performing their ancient liturgy in Ge'ez, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to make the stone walls themselves resonate. For the first time since the incident, Kenji closed his eyes while standing before the cross, not to meditate, not to analyze, but simply to listen. And in that moment of surrender, he finally understood. The hand reaching out in his visions wasn't asking him to convert or confess or accept specific theological propositions. It was asking him to recognize what he had always known but never admitted, that love was real, that suffering could be transformed, that the invisible connections between people mattered more than any philosophical system. His Buddhist practice had taught him to observe suffering without attachment. What he was learning here was something different, not detachment from suffering, but engagement with it, the willingness to kneel in the dirt of human brokenness and help clean it up. Brother Sebastian appeared beside him. "Tomorrow is your last day with us, isn't it? Your visa expires soon." "Yes," Kenji said. "I fly back to Japan on Monday." "Have you found what you came here for?" Kenji considered the question. He had come to Jerusalem to prove Christianity false, to expose the emptiness of faith-based belief systems, to document how geography and tradition created the illusion of the sacred. Instead, he had discovered that pride was its own prison, that intellectual certainty could be a form of cowardice, and that sometimes you had to break something before you could understand why it mattered. I don't know if I found what I came for, Kenji admitted, but I found something I didn't know I needed. Brother Sebastian nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had watched this transformation countless times. That's usually how it works. We ask God for answers, and he gives us questions that change us. I'm still not sure I believe in God, Kenji said honestly. At least not the way you do. That's all right, the friar replied. God believes in you. That seems sufficient for now. Sunday morning, Kenji's final day in Jerusalem, arrived with a brilliance that seemed designed for farewells. The sky was impossibly blue, the ancient stones glowing gold in the early light, the air carrying the mingled scents of Arabic coffee, fresh bread, and the particular fragrance of a city where heaven and earth had been arguing for millennia. Kenji arrived at the church before dawn, as had become his custom. Brother Sebastian was already there, as always, preparing for the day's services. They worked together in comfortable silence, two men from vastly different traditions, united by the simple act of service. Around 7 a.m, pilgrims began to arrive for morning prayers. Kenji watched them come. Elderly women with rosaries, young couples holding hands, families with small children, solitary seekers carrying burdens, visible only in their eyes. He saw Marcus from the hostel, the American who had challenged him that first night. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and Marcus's expression shifted from surprise to something like understanding. He walked over slowly. "You're the guy who said our God was a fairy tale," Marcus said without hostility. "The one who was going to prove the cross was just wood." "I did prove that," Kenji replied quietly. "Wood breaks when you hit it. I was right about that." "But wrong about what it meant." Kenji considered the question carefully. "I don't know if I was wrong. I just understand now that being right about something small doesn't mean you understand something large. The cross is wood. It's also more than wood. Both things can be true." Marcus extended his hand. "I'm sorry I challenged your faith that night. That was arrogant of me." Kenji shook his hand, feeling the strange symmetry of the moment. "I'm sorry I attacked yours. That was arrogant of me too. Maybe we were both right and both wrong." They talked for a while, not arguing this time, but genuinely trying to understand each other's perspectives. Marcus explained how his faith had sustained him through his father's death from cancer, how prayer had given him a way to process grief that therapy alone couldn't reach. Kenji shared his own journey through Buddhism, his mother's deathbed conversion, his anger at religious certainty. "I think," Marcus said thoughtfully, "that maybe faith and doubt aren't opposites. Maybe they're dance partners. You can't have real faith without real doubt, and you can't have meaningful doubt without taking faith seriously enough to question it." The observation struck Kenji as surprisingly profound for a casual conversation in a church courtyard. "Is that from your Bible?" "No, that's from 3 years of therapy and a really good spiritual director," Marcus laughed. "But I think Jesus would approve. He spent a lot of time with doubters." Around 9 a.m, a small crowd gathered in the courtyard. Pilgrims, tourists, local volunteers. Brother Sebastian had quietly spread the word that today was Kenji's last day, and people wanted to say goodbye to the Japanese man who had spent a week sweeping their sacred space. Professor Sarah Cohen, the tour guide from the university, was there. So was Miriam, the nurse from the hospital, Maria from the Philippines, the woman who had thanked him for keeping the church clean, Min-jun and his Korean theology students. Even Dr. Levi, his doctor, had somehow heard and stopped by between shifts. "We wanted to offer a blessing," Brother Sebastian explained, "for your journey home and whatever comes next, if you're comfortable with that." Kenji felt tears threatening. "I'm not Christian. I don't know if I believe in blessings." "Fortunately," Brother Sebastian replied, with a smile, "blessings don't require your belief to work. They just require your willingness to receive." They formed a circle around him, Christians and Jews, believers and skeptics, people who had forgiven him for an act he hadn't realized needed forgiving. Brother Sebastian placed his weathered hand on Kenji's head and spoke in a mixture of Latin and English. "May the God who created you, the Christ who redeemed you, and the Spirit who sustains you, bless your going out and your coming in, your doubting and your believing, your questions and your quest for truth. May you find peace not in certainty, but in love. May you discover that you are known, even when you don't know, and may you always remember that sacred things are sacred, not because they can't be broken, but because they continue to hold meaning even in their brokenness." The circle echoed, Amen. Kenji stood in the centre of their blessing, feeling the impossible weight of grace, unearned, unexpected, uncontrollable. This was what his Buddhist practice had never quite captured, the experience of being loved not because of what you achieved or understood, but simply because you existed.